So we're now going to talk about the client-side structure and functionality of this LockManager app case study. And again, you can get that at my GitHub repository, focusing on this part over here, which again sends synchronous requests and responses. So what we're going to do here is introduce the concept of an HTTP interface, which is a brand spanking new feature of Spring, came out a few months ago as part of Spring 6. So new, in fact, you can't get help from ChatGPT if you want to learn how to use it. So you have to rely on the old school way of like reading web links. Ugh, terrible. So this is basically what we can do. So we have a lock API that uses the new HTTP interface features. And what we have here are a bunch of methods that mimic the same thing you'd see on the controller side. So we've got create, acquire, release, and so on. This model, for my money, is much cleaner than using retrofit for at least two reasons. And we'll see what those two reasons are in a second as we go a little further. One reason is because you have good old conventional Java return types as the return types, just like the controller. Whereas with retrofit, if you recall, you had to put those weird call objects on there and then have your own little proxy class that made the request and took the result back and checked if it was successful or not, blah, 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 blah. Very ugly, very messy. And the second reason it's nice is that we've got annotations that are a lot more like what you see with the controller annotations. Now, this part's slightly different. I don't know why they don't use post mapping and get mapping, but they use post exchange and get exchange. But it's basically like post mapping and get mapping. You have the same path names here. And then you have the same types of annotations for things like the body. So request body, request param. That's exactly like what you'd have on the controller side. So it's a lot, again, for my money, it's a lot cleaner, a lot more intuitive, and very simple. It integrates with Spring. So it's a wonderful enhancement that was not there until very recently. How do you create one of these things? Well, you create one of these things in very much the same way that we created things for retrofit, just slight tweaks. So we end up having a getLock API factory method, which we define as a bean, just like we did before. So I put that in my client beans class, which is annotated as a component. And then I just make a couple of calls. This call chain here creates something called a web client. I mentioned web client before. Web client's basically a way of being able to make calls that are either synchronous or asynchronous using either Java conventional reference types or the more advanced reactive types. So here we're going to go ahead and make ourselves a web client that's connected to the LockManager server. And then this is the part that's brand spanking new with Spring 6. There's this new thing called HTTP Service Proxy Factory. And we go ahead and take the web client we made up here, and we adapt it to work with this HTTP Service Proxy Factory. And then we say, create a client, please. And you give it the class file for the lock API, which was this thing back over here. And it'll go ahead and make us an instance of one of those things. So that looks very much like the builder pattern mechanism that we had for the retrofit, just a little cleaner and better integrated into Spring. Again, the downside with this stuff is there's only a handful of links that explain this in any detail. And they're also, at least from my reading at this point, there's a few features that retrofit has, particularly things related to what are called dynamic paths, that don't appear to be supported yet with HTTP interface. And that actually is annoying. And you won't see it here in this example, but when we talk about a more interesting example, probably next class, you'll see that you have to do a couple of extra things on the client side to work around the limitations. Now, it could just be that they haven't documented it, or I haven't figured out how to get the documentation to tell me what's there, but I could not see those features that were available in retrofit for dynamic path mechanisms available here in HTTP interface.